In Mateau's ruthless world, power is measured in silence, and emotion is a weakness he cannot afford. At his best friend's wedding, amidst a ceremony of calculated perfection, his universe of absolute control is fractured by an unexpected flaw. Clara, the bridesmaid who arrives late, bringing with her a beautiful chaos and a vulnerability he hasn't felt in years. She is a restorer of rare books, a woman who lives to mend what time has broken. He is a man who breaks everything he touches. Their meeting is a collision of two worlds, one of light and one of shadow, one of creation and one of destruction. A dance in the moonlight ignites an obsession, and Mateu, who commands an empire, decides he must have her. But to enter her world, he cannot use force. He needs a pretext, a legitimate reason to get close to the only person who has awakened something inside him. And he finds it in a priceless, damaged ancient book. This is a story about a dangerous man captivated by the one woman who can see past his facade, and a quiet woman faced with the most perilous choice of her life: to fix the book, or to try and save the man. Hello, and welcome. Before we dive into tonight's story, we'd love to feel your presence. Let us know in the comments which city or country you're watching from, and just say hello so we know you're here with us. We love seeing how far our stories travel, and if you're new here, or haven't yet, please be sure to subscribe to the channel to become part of our community and never miss a chapter. Now settle in. Take a deep breath. Our story begins. The air in St. Michael's Cathedral was a carefully constructed lie. It was meant to smell of reverence, of ancient stone, melting beeswax, and the cloying sweetness of 1,000 white lilies suffocating in the heat. But to Mateu, it smelled only of obligation. He sat in the front pew, a figure carved from stillness, his dark suit a void against the riot of color pouring through the stained glass windows. This wasn't a church, it was a theater, and he was its most unwilling and most powerful spectator. His world was not one of light and organ music. It was a realm of shadows, of whispered conversations in soundproofed rooms, of ledgers where names were assets and debts were paid in currencies far more valuable than cash. Power, for him, was a silent, heavy coat he never took off. It was in the way the other guests, powerful men in their own right, with empires of steel and concrete, avoided his gaze. It was in the subtle, deferential dip of a politician's chin from across the aisle. They were all here for the wedding of his best friend, his right hand, Luca, but their respect was aimed at him. It was a constant, exhausting performance of control. He felt a muscle in his jaw tighten, a minute rebellion he instantly suppressed. He despised weddings. They were a parade of forced sentimentality, a garish display of a vulnerability he had surgically removed from his own life years ago. He watched Luca at the altar, a good man, a loyal man, looking uncharacteristically nervous. A small alien part of Mateu felt a flicker of something akin to affection, but he buried it immediately. Affection was a liability. The organ, which had been murmuring a prelude, swelled into the grand familiar march. The heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral swung open, and the procession began. Bridesmaids, one by one, floated down the aisle in gowns the color of a twilight sky. Each one was perfect, poised, their smiles as practiced and symmetrical as the floral arrangements lining the nave. Mateu's gaze swept over them, cataloging, dismissing. They were beautiful, interchangeable dolls. He registered them not as women, but as part of the pageantry. But his count came up short. There were 5 bridesmaids at the altar. There should have been 6. A low murmur, like the rustle of dry leaves, skittered through the pews. A flaw in the perfect tapestry of the day. A loose thread. Mateu felt a prickle of irritation. Luca's new wife, Amelia, was a perfectionist. This small disruption would be a source of private fury for her. Mateu's mind, ever the strategist, began calculating the source of the failure. A broken-down car? A trivial act of rebellion? It was an insignificant detail, yet it grated on his need for absolute order. The bride began her long walk, a vision in lace and pearls, and the guests rose to their feet. But just as Amelia reached the halfway point, a sound broke the sacred rhythm of the march. It was not a loud sound, but it was so profoundly out of place that it sliced through the cathedral's atmosphere like a shard of glass. It was the frantic, desperate squeal of the ancient oak door hinge, followed by a sharp gasp of air. Every head, save for those in the wedding party, turned. Mathieu's gaze, cold and analytical, snapped to the entrance. And then he saw her. She wasn't an entrance. She was an impact. A beautiful, chaotic collision with the day's suffocating perfection. This, he knew instantly, was the missing bridesmaid. She stood frozen on the threshold, her body a testament to a battle lost against time. The twilight blue dress was rumpled. The delicate fabric creased in a way that spoke of a frantic rush, not a leisurely morning of preparation. A single dark curl had sprung free from her elaborate hairstyle, clinging to the damp skin of her temple. Her chest rose and fell in ragged, visible breaths. Her cheeks were not delicately blushed, but flushed with the raw, vibrant red of exertion and mortification. She held a small bouquet of lilies in a white-knuckled grip, as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the ground. But it was her eyes that seized him. They were wide, the color of warm whiskey, and they were swimming with a panic so pure and unguarded it felt like a violation to witness it. They darted across the sea of staring faces, a hunted animal searching for cover. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Mathieu felt something stir within him that he did not control. It was not desire, not in the simple, predatory way he understood it. It was a jolt of recognition. In a room filled with masks, she was devastatingly, incandescently real. Her chaos was more beautiful than all the calculated perfection of the ceremony. It was a single true note in an orchestra of lies. He, who could command a room with a subtle shift in his posture, found himself utterly still. He forgot the music. He forgot the bride, his friend, the 100 powerful enemies and allies surrounding him. His entire world, a vast and intricate chessboard, had shrunk to the space she occupied. He could feel the frantic thumping of her heart from 50 feet away. He could almost taste the coppery tang of her panic on his tongue. She seemed to shrink under the weight of 100 gazes, her shoulders hunching slightly. Then, with a visible swallow, she forced herself into motion. Head down, her focus locked on the marble floor as if her life depended on it, she began a half-run, half-walk along the side aisle, a shadow trying to merge with the stone walls. She wasn't trying to make an entrance, she was trying to erase the one she'd already made. He watched her every move. He noted the slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her hands as she finally reached the front and slipped into the empty space at the end of the bridal line. She kept her head bowed, her chin tucked, her entire being radiating a desperate wish to become invisible. He could see the tension in the cord of her neck, the rigid set of her back as she fought to regain her composure. The ceremony resumed its course. The priest spoke of union and sanctity. Vows were exchanged in clear, rehearsed voices. Rings, cold and golden, were slid onto fingers. Mathieu heard the words, but they were a distant hum, the soundtrack to the silent film playing out in his mind. His focus remained locked on the woman in blue. He watched as she forced her hands to still, as she lifted her chin just enough to be respectable, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance, deliberately seeing nothing. He saw the moment a single stray tear escaped her and traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of joy for the happy couple. He knew, with an instinct that had kept him alive for years, that it was a tear of frustration, of shame, of being overwhelmed. And the sight of that single silent tear ignited a strange, unfamiliar fire in his chest. It was a fiercely protective, possessive feeling that had no logical origin. It was an impulse to stride down that aisle, erase the stares of the crowd, and shield her from a world that had clearly, in some way, wronged her today. The thought was so alien, so contrary to his nature, that it felt like a betrayal of himself. He was Mathieu. He did not protect. He owned. He did not comfort. He controlled. Luca and Amelia kissed. The crowd erupted in polite, joyous applause. The organ thundered a triumphant recessional. As the wedding party turned to leave, Mathieu's eyes sought hers one last time. For a fleeting second, as she turned, her gaze lifted and accidentally, impossibly, met his. The world fell away. The noise, the people, the lilies, it all dissolved into a meaningless blur. In that fraction of a second, he saw it all again, the panic, the fragility, the fight. But he saw something else, too. A flicker of profound depth, a resilience buried beneath the surface of her distress. Then, as quickly as it happened, she looked away, a fresh wave of color rising in her cheeks as she realized she had been caught staring at the man in the front pew. She disappeared down the aisle with the rest of the procession, swallowed by the crowd. But her image was burned onto the back of his eyelids. The chaos, the flush on her skin, the single defiant curl, the whiskey-colored eyes that had seen him for one terrifying second. The ceremony was over. But for Mathieu, something had just begun. The flaw in the day's perfection was no longer an irritation. It had become an obsession. He rose from his seat, his movements as smooth and deliberate as always, but inside, a tectonic plate had shifted. The silent, ordered world he had so carefully constructed had been fractured, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would not rest until he knew the name of the woman who had shattered it. The reception was held at a sprawling country club, a place so manicured and pristine it felt sterile. Crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables laden with towering floral arrangements and gleaming silverware. The air hummed with the forced cheerfulness of cocktail hour, a symphony of clinking glasses, polite laughter, and the low thrum of a string quartet playing something forgettable in the corner. For Mathieu, the change of venue did nothing to alter the suffocating atmosphere. It was the same theater, just a different stage. He stood near a set of French doors that opened onto a terrace, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand. The cold, solid weight of the crystal was a familiar anchor in a sea of meaningless social rituals. People orbited him, their paths carefully calculated. They would approach with feigned casualness, offer congratulations for Luca, and then attempt to pivot to business. He deflected them all with a quiet word or a look so devoid of warmth it could freeze steam. He was a master of building invisible walls. But tonight, his walls had cracks. His gaze swept the ballroom, not with its usual strategic assessment, but with a singular predatory focus. He was scanning for a splash of twilight blue. He found her standing near the behemoth of a wedding cake, partially obscured by a potted fern. Clara. He had learned her name from Luca in a brief, clipped exchange. Clara, Amelia's cousin, always running on her own time. Luca had said it with a shake of his head, a fond annoyance. To Mathieu, the name felt quiet and simple, a stark contrast to the beautiful disarray of the woman herself. She was nursing a glass of champagne, holding it with both hands as if it were a shield. She was no longer the epicenter of a crisis, but the quiet awkwardness of her posture told him she still felt the sting of her late arrival. She wasn't mingling. She was hiding in plain sight, her attention fixed on the intricate sugar flowers of the cake, studying them with an intensity that suggested she was trying to memorize their every petal. He watched the way her fingers, long and delicate, traced the condensation on her glass. He imagined those fingers, stained with ink or dust from old books, painstakingly mending a torn page. There was a quiet competence in them that fascinated him. He watched the subtle way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a small, restless movement that betrayed the calm she was trying to project. He could feel her discomfort from across the room, a low-frequency hum that vibrated somewhere deep in his chest. No one was talking to her. She was an island. The other bridesmaids, now clustered together in a cloud of perfume and self-congratulation, occasionally sent cool glances in her direction. She was the flaw, the one who had marred the perfect photograph. Mathieu felt that same illogical surge of anger from the church. It was a primitive, territorial instinct to clear the room, to silence the whispers, to eliminate the judgment in their eyes. He hated the feeling. It was a loss of control, and he hadn't willingly surrendered control of an emotion in 15 years. He made a decision. It wasn't a thought, not a plan, but a pure, undeniable impulse. He set his untouched whiskey on a passing waiter's tray and began to move. The crowd parted for him. It always did. It was a silent, instinctive deference he had cultivated over years of absolute authority. He moved not with speed, but with a deliberate, unnerving grace, his destination clear. He saw the moment she sensed his approach. Her shoulders tensed before she even looked up. It was as if she could feel the shift in the room's energy, the sudden focus of the predator. Her head lifted slowly, and those whiskey-colored eyes met his. The panic from the church was gone, replaced by a guarded curiosity, a quiet apprehension. Up close, he could see the faint dusting of freckles across the bridge of her nose, a detail so human and imperfect it was breathtaking. He stopped a respectable distance from her, careful not to crowd her, not to intimidate. It was a conscious act of restraint, a courtesy he rarely extended to anyone. "Clara," he said. Her name was a low murmur, not a question. She gave a small, startled blink. The sound of her name from his lips seemed to surprise her. "Yes," she replied, her voice softer than he'd imagined, like worn velvet. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" Mathieu. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't offer a title. Just his name. It was all that was ever needed. He watched her process it, saw the flicker of recognition, the subtle widening of her eyes as she placed him. She knew who he was. Everyone in this room knew who he was. She was the bride's cousin, but she was also now in the orbit of Luca's world, Matteo's world. A faint blush crept up her neck, a lovely traitorous color that betrayed her composure. "Of course. You're Luca's best man." "I am," he confirmed, his gaze unwavering. "You caused quite a stir today." He said it without judgment, a flat statement of fact, but he saw her flinch. Her knuckles whitened around her champagne flute. It was unavoidable. A crisis at work. I apologize if I disrupted the ceremony. "You didn't disrupt it," Matteo said, and he leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. The air between them suddenly felt charged, intimate. "You improved it. Perfection is tiresome." Her breath hitched. It was a tiny, almost inaudible sound, but to his heightened senses, it was as loud as a gunshot. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time. Her head tilted, and he could see the gears turning behind her eyes. She was reevaluating him, trying to reconcile the man of fearsome reputation with the man who had just paid her the strangest, most unexpected compliment. I don't think Amelia would agree with you," she stammered, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. It was a small, nervous gesture, but it transformed her face, softening the edges of her anxiety. "Amelia's opinion is of little consequence to me," he stated simply. The honesty of the remark, so blunt and out of place amidst the evening's polite fictions, seemed to disarm her completely. A comfortable silence fell between them. It wasn't empty. It was filled with the things they weren't saying. He wanted to ask what kind of crisis could make a woman like her late for her cousin's wedding. He wanted to know what she did for a living that could command such urgent devotion. He wanted to trace the line of that escaped curl on her temple. She broke the silence first. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For what?" "For not looking at me like I'm a mess." Her gaze flickered toward the other bridesmaids, a flicker so fast he almost missed it. But he didn't. He missed nothing. "A mess is a matter of perspective," he replied. "I see someone who fought a battle today and showed up anyway. Most people don't show up for the battle at all." He had no idea where the words came from. They were not calculated. They were not part of a strategy. They were a truth that had risen unbidden from some deep, long-dormant part of himself. Her reaction was profound. The tension in her shoulders eased. The guarded look in her eyes softened into something warmer, something vulnerable. It was as if his words had given her permission to breathe. He had spent his life making people breathless with fear. He was discovering, in that moment, that making one person breathe with relief was a far more potent form of power. And it was a power he found, to his own astonishment, he wanted to wield again and again. Only for her. The string quartet had been replaced by a live band, and the music shifted from polite background noise to a persistent rhythmic pulse that vibrated through the polished floorboards. The ballroom was louder now, fuller, the initial restraint of the guests dissolving under the influence of expensive wine and the illusion of safety. Couples were beginning to drift toward the dance floor, moving in prescribed, elegant circles, under the chandelier's cold light. Mathieu had not moved. He remained by Clara's side, a silent sentinel. He had created a small, invisible bubble of stillness around them. No one approached. No one interrupted. His mere presence was a shield, a do not disturb sign written in a language of power that everyone in the room understood. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that she felt it too. She was no longer an anxious island. She was a protected territory. He watched her sip her champagne, her movements less guarded now. She still wasn't entirely comfortable, but the frantic, hunted energy was gone, replaced by a quiet watchfulness. She was observing the room, her gaze lingering on the dancing couples with a wistful, almost academic curiosity, as if she were studying the customs of a foreign tribe. "You're not a dancer," he stated. It was not a question. He had already catalogued her every gesture. He knew the way she held herself, with a kind of inward-turning grace, suggested a person more at home in quiet, focused spaces than on a crowded dance floor. Her lips curved into that small, hesitant smile again. It did something strange to his insides, a slow, unfamiliar tightening in his chest. "Is it that obvious?" "You watch them like you're reading a book," he said, trying to understand the structure, the unspoken rules. Her eyes widened slightly, and she turned her full attention back to him. The look she gave him was one of genuine surprise, of being seen in a way she did not expect. "That's remarkably accurate. My work involves finding the story beneath the surface. I suppose it becomes a habit." The opening was there. The question he had wanted to ask in the church. Your work. The crisis that made you late. The smile vanished from her lips, replaced by a faint shadow of the earlier anxiety. Her gaze dropped back to her glass. It must seem terribly trivial. A family emergency, a medical issue, those are valid reasons to be late. A book is not. "Tell me," he commanded. The word was too harsh, too accustomed to being obeyed. He saw her stiffen and mentally cursed himself. He softened his tone, a subtle modulation that cost him a significant effort. "I'd like to know." She hesitated for a moment, swirling the pale gold liquid in her flute. "I'm a book and paper conservator," she began, her voice low. "I restore rare manuscripts. This morning I was working on a 15th century book of hours. The humidity levels in the lab's vault malfunctioned overnight. The vellum pages were beginning to buckle. If I had left it, the illumination, the ink, it would have been catastrophic. Irreversible damage." He listened, picturing it. He saw her, not in this ill-fitting bridesmaid dress, but in a quiet, sunlit room, her brow furrowed in concentration. Those delicate, capable hands working with painstaking precision to save something beautiful and fragile from ruin. The image was so vivid, so powerful, it eclipsed the entire ballroom. She wasn't just a restorer of objects, she was a guardian of history, of stories. She fought against time and decay. "So you chose to save a 500-year-old book over arriving on time to your cousin's wedding," he summarized. "It sounds awful when you say it like that," she murmured, a flush creeping back into her cheeks. "I know it was the wrong choice, socially. I hurt Amelia's feelings. But I couldn't just walk away. It felt like leaving a living thing to die." "It wasn't the wrong choice," Mathieu said, and the conviction in his own voice surprised him. He, a man who dealt in the brutal, unsentimental present, found himself in awe of her dedication to the past. His world was about tearing things down. Hers was about putting them back together. It was the only choice you could have made. It shows character, devotion. Her eyes, whiskey warm and searching, locked with his. The polite conversation had evaporated. They were in a different territory now, a place of unexpected, raw honesty. She saw something in his face, an intensity that was both frightening and compelling, and she didn't look away. It was Luca who broke the spell. He appeared at Mathieu's elbow, his face flushed with champagne and happiness. "There you are, hiding in the corner. I need to steal my best man for a toast." He then smiled warmly at Clara. "And Cousin Clara, I see you've met the man of mystery. Don't let him intimidate you." His bark is significantly worse than his bite. Matteo's gaze on Luca was glacial. The interruption was like a bucket of ice water, snapping him back to the suffocating reality of the reception. But Clara simply offered Luca a genuine, gentle smile. "He's been perfect company, Luca. Congratulations. You and Amelia are beautiful together." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. There was no jealousy, no lingering resentment over the morning's silent judgment. She was simply, purely happy for her cousin. This, Matteo realized, was another facet of her character, a capacity for grace under pressure. "I'll be back," Matteo said to her. It was not a suggestion, it was a promise, a vow. She simply nodded, her eyes holding his for a second longer than necessary, before he turned to follow Luca toward the stage. As he walked away, he could feel her gaze on his back. The feeling was as tangible as a touch, a warm spot between his shoulder blades. He stood beside Luca on the stage, the microphone in his hand, the faces of 100 powerful people turned up toward him. He delivered the toast he had prepared, the words flowing with their usual practiced ease. He spoke of loyalty, of brotherhood, of the future. The words were perfect. The delivery was flawless. The applause was thunderous. But he wasn't there. His mind was still standing in the corner by the wedding cake. He was thinking about the smell of old paper and the quiet intensity of a woman who would risk social disgrace to save a dying story. He was thinking about her blush, her smile, the way she made him feel something other than the cold, hard weight of his own power. As he raised his glass to the bride and groom, his eyes found hers in the crowd. She was watching him, her expression unreadable. And in that moment, Matteo understood that the greatest danger in the room wasn't the rival family head sitting at table 3, or the ambitious underling who wanted his position. The greatest danger was a quiet book restorer in a twilight blue dress, who had, in the space of a single evening, breached every one of his defenses without even trying. The toast was done. The requisite handshakes and backpats were endured. Matteo extricated himself from the suffocating crush of well-wishers with a practiced, ruthless efficiency. His movements were fluid, economical, each step taking him back toward the corner where he had left Clara. But she was gone. The space by the wedding cake was empty. Her champagne flute sat abandoned on a nearby table, a faint trace of her lipstick on the rim. A cold, irrational anger coiled in his gut. It was the anger of a strategist whose carefully planned move had been unexpectedly countered. He had made a promise. "I'll be back." And he had expected her to be there, waiting. It was an arrogant assumption, he knew, born of a lifetime of people waiting for him. But the disappointment was sharp, physical. His gaze swept the room again, this time with a cold, methodical precision. He scanned the dance floor, the bar, the clusters of gossiping guests. He didn't see her. It was as if she had simply evaporated. The ballroom, which moments ago had felt charged with a strange new energy, now seemed flat and colorless, the noise and music grating on his nerves. He turned toward the French doors he had stood beside earlier, a primal instinct guiding him. The doors were slightly ajar, letting in a sliver of the cool night air. He pushed one open and stepped out onto the wide stone terrace. The change was immediate. The oppressive heat and noise of the reception fell away, replaced by the gentle chirping of crickets and the whisper of a breeze rustling through the meticulously landscaped gardens. The terrace was dimly lit by ornate lanterns, casting long, dancing shadows. And there, at the far end, silhouetted against the vast, dark expanse of the golf course, was her silhouette. She was standing at the stone balustrade, her arms wrapped around herself, not as if she were cold, but as if she were holding herself together. She had taken off her uncomfortable heels, which sat neatly beside her on the ground. She was staring up at the moon, a perfect silver disk in the inky sky, and for a moment, Matteo simply watched her. Here, away from the judgment and the noise, she seemed different. The anxious energy had settled, replaced by a profound and lonely stillness. He could see the elegant line of her neck, the gentle curve of her spine. She looked fragile and strong at the same time, a paradox that tightened something in his chest. He felt like an intruder, a shadow spying on a private, sacred moment. The feeling was unwelcome. He was never the intruder. He was the one whose presence defined the space. He moved toward her, his expensive leather shoes making almost no sound on the flagstones. She didn't startle until he was only a few feet away, a testament to how deeply lost in thought she had been. "I told you I'd be back," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. She turned, her hand flying to her chest in a small, involuntary gesture of surprise. "Mathieu, I just needed some air. It was getting a little loud in there." "I know." He came to stand beside her at the balustrade, not too close, but near enough that he could feel the faint warmth radiating from her. He could smell her scent, not perfume, but something far more subtle and intoxicating. It was the clean scent of her skin, mixed with a faint, papery smell he imagined clung to her from her work. It was the scent of her. They stood in silence for a long moment, looking out at the darkness. It was a different kind of silence than the one they had shared inside. This one was deeper, more natural, filled with the sounds of the night. "It's peaceful out here," she said softly. "Peace is a rare commodity," he replied, the words tasting like gravel in his mouth. Peace was a foreign concept to him, a luxury afforded to men who didn't sleep with one eye open. She turned her head to look at him, her expression serious in the soft lantern light. "You don't seem like a man who has much of it." It was a bold statement, a direct and personal observation that no one had dared make to his face in years. He felt the old, familiar instinct to shut down, to retreat behind his mask of cold indifference. But he found he couldn't. Not with her. "I'm not," he admitted. The confession felt like a stone dropping into a deep well. Why not? The question was simple, direct, devoid of fear or guile. She wasn't trying to pry or gain an advantage. She was just curious. He looked at her earnest, open face, and felt a dangerous impulse to tell her the truth. To tell her about the weight of the empire he commanded, about the violence that was the bedrock of his power, about the ghosts that haunted his quietest moments. But he couldn't. To invite her into that world would be to stain her. "My work," he said finally, the words a vast and deliberate understatement, "is complicated." A small, knowing smile touched her lips. Like a book written in a language no one else can read? The analogy was so unexpected, so perfect, that it left him momentarily speechless. She saw his world not as a battlefield, but as a text, a complex, coded narrative. In one sentence, she had shown more understanding than anyone in his entire life. "Something like that," he conceded, his voice hoarse. She turned back to the view, her arms still wrapped around herself. "I think I can understand that. Sometimes when I'm working on a manuscript, I'm the only person in the world who knows its secrets. The notes scribbled in the margins by a monk 5 centuries ago, the tiny flaws in the parchment, the reason a certain passage was crossed out. It's a very solitary feeling, to be the only one who knows the whole story." He was staring at her profile, at the way the moonlight caught the curve of her cheekbone. He had built his entire life on being the only one who knew the whole story. He had always considered it a position of ultimate strength. But hearing her describe it, he heard the echo of its true name for the first time. Loneliness. "What is your story, Clara?" he asked, the question slipping out before he could stop it. It was too personal, too direct. She gave a soft, self-deprecating laugh. "My story? Oh, it's not very exciting. It's quiet and dusty and filled with things most people have forgotten." "I don't believe that," he said, his voice intense. "I think your story is about saving things. And there is nothing more exciting or more important than that." She was silent. He watched as a wave of emotion washed over her face. Surprise, confusion, and something else. Something that looked dangerously like hope. She finally turned to face him fully, the stone balustrade pressing against her back. The space between them felt impossibly small, charged with a current that had nothing to do with the polite fiction of the wedding reception inside. "No one's ever said that about my work before," she whispered. "About me? Then they haven't been paying attention," he said. And with a slow, deliberate movement that felt both terrifying and inevitable, he reached out and gently tucked the escaped curl of her hair behind her ear. His knuckles brushed the soft, warm skin of her temple. The touch was electric, a jolt that shot through his arm and straight into his chest. He saw her pupils dilate, felt the soft hitch of her breath. The entire world, the crickets, the breeze, the distant music, faded to nothing. There was only the feeling of her skin beneath his fingers, and the sudden, overwhelming, undeniable need to lean in closer. Time stretched and became molasses slow. Mateau's fingers lingered for a fraction of a second against her skin, a brand of warmth in the cool night air. It was the most tentative, most gentle touch he had ever bestowed, yet it carried the weight of a tectonic shift. For him, touch was about control, about possession, about asserting dominance. This was different. This was a question, an exploration. Her breath caught, a soft, sharp sound in the intimate quiet. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. Instead, her body seemed to lean into his touch, an infinitesimal, magnetic pull that he felt all the way to his core. Her whiskey-colored eyes were wide, luminous in the moonlight, and in their depths, he saw not fear, but a dawning, dizzying sense of wonder. It was the same look of discovery he imagined she wore when uncovering a hidden detail in one of her ancient manuscripts. He was a text she was suddenly, inexplicably reading. The urge to close the distance between them was a physical ache, a visceral, primal need that overrode every calculated instinct he possessed. His world was one of consequences, of actions and reactions, of moves planned 10 steps in advance. But here, with her, there was no strategy. There was only the raw, undeniable gravity of the present moment. He let his hand fall away, the loss of contact feeling immediate and profound. He saw a flicker of disappointment in her eyes before she masked it. He curled his fingers into a fist at his side, the memory of her skin's texture, impossibly soft, unbelievably warm, already a phantom sensation he wanted to reclaim. I should go back inside, she whispered, but she made no move to leave. Her voice was unsteady, a fragile thread in the charged silence. She was still pinned by his gaze, by the unspoken thing that had just passed between them. Why? He asked, his voice low and rough. He didn't want her to go. He wanted to keep her here, in the moonlight, in this bubble of stolen time where the rules of his world didn't seem to apply. My cousin. The bridesmaids. They'll wonder where I am. Her reasons sounded hollow, like excuses she was feeding herself, trying to rebuild the wall he had just effortlessly breached. Let them wonder, Mathieu said, and the words were a quiet dismissal of her entire world of social obligation. He was offering her an escape, a temporary asylum in his own territory of defiance. For a man who offered nothing for free, it was an unprecedented gift. She looked from his eyes to his mouth and back again, a silent, flickering debate playing out on her face. He could see the war within her, the ingrained habit of doing the right thing, of being the good cousin, the reliable one, versus this new, terrifying, and exhilarating possibility. I'm not like you, she said, her voice barely audible. I can't just dismiss people. Obligations. I know, he said softly. And that was the entire point. She was everything he was not. She was light to his shadow, creation to his destruction, duty to his dominance. And for some reason, instead of creating a chasm between them, it had forged a connection so powerful, it left him breathless. A new song started inside the ballroom, a slow, melodic ballad. The sound drifted out onto the terrace, a melancholy, romantic tune that wrapped around them. Without thinking, without planning, he held out his hand. It was an invitation, a question, a monumental risk. Clara stared at his hand. It was a large hand, powerful, with clean, short nails and scarred knuckles that spoke of a violence she could not comprehend. It was a hand that could break things. That had broken things. And yet, it was offered to her now, palm up, in a gesture of pure, unadorned invitation. She hesitated for what felt like an eternity. He could see the pulse beating frantically at the base of her throat. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply waited, allowing her the one thing he rarely gave anyone, a choice. He was prepared for rejection. He was half expecting it. A A woman like her should, by all rights, run from a man like him. But then, with a slow, deliberate grace that made his heart hammer against his ribs, she lifted her own hand and placed it in his. Her fingers were cool and slender against his palm. Her touch was tentative, yet firm. The moment their skin met, the low-level hum of electricity that had been crackling between them ignited. It was not a spark. It was a wildfire. He curled his fingers around hers, his thumb stroking the delicate skin of her wrist. He felt her shiver. He gently pulled her away from the balustrade, toward the center of the empty terrace. The lanterns cast a soft golden glow around them, creating a private dance floor just for them. He placed his other hand on the small of her back, the fine, rumpled silk of her dress a thin barrier against the warmth of her skin. She rested her free hand on his shoulder, her touch as light as a sigh. And then, they began to move. It wasn't a dance of practiced steps. It was a slow, simple sway, a shared rhythm guided by the melancholy music and the silent, thunderous beating of their own hearts. He led, she followed, their bodies moving together with an ease that felt both new and ancient. He held her with a careful reverence, terrified that if he held on too tightly, this beautiful, fragile creature would shatter in his arms. He looked down at her. Her head was bowed slightly, her gaze fixed on the lapel of his suit. He could see the long, dark sweep of her lashes against her cheek. He could smell that intoxicating, unique scent of her. For the first time, he felt a moment of something that resembled peace. It was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of her. He had orchestrated 1,000 power plays, negotiated 100 treaties, ended a dozen wars. But none of it, had ever felt as significant as this. Holding this woman in his arms, under the moon, swaying to a forgotten song. He realized with a terrifying clarity that he was no longer the one in control. He had offered his hand, and she had taken it, and in doing so, she had taken something else entirely. Something he hadn't even known he had to give. The song ended. The final mournful note of a violin hung in the night air for a moment, and then dissolved into the chirping of the crickets. But they didn't stop moving. For a few heartbeats, they continued their slow, silent sway, caught in the melody's wake, unwilling to break the spell. Matteo was the first to still. He had to. The intimacy of the moment was becoming a physical presence, a third entity in the space between them. It was too much, too fast. His mind, the cold, calculating engine that had ensured his survival for 3 decades, was screaming at him. Danger, vulnerability, exposure. He slowly, reluctantly, loosened his grip, his hand sliding from the small of her back. He kept hold of her hand, though. The thought of completely breaking the physical connection was unbearable. Her hand felt small and impossibly fragile in his. He lifted it, turning it over, his thumb tracing the delicate blue veins that ran beneath the pale skin of her wrist. He was studying her, as if she were a map to a country he had never known existed. Clara finally lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. The guardedness was gone, stripped away by the music and the moonlight. What remained was a raw, unguarded vulnerability that mirrored the chaos in his own chest. Her lips were slightly parted, her breathing soft and even. She wasn't looking at him as Matteo, the feared Don, the powerful businessman. She was looking at the man who had just held her as if she were made of spun glass. "Your hands," he said, his voice a low rasp. He ran his thumb over her fingertips, noting the faint calluses. "They don't match the rest of you." A faint, curious frown touched her brow. "What do you mean?" "The rest of you is soft." He struggled to find the word. "Elegant. These are working hands. Strong." He knew instinctively that these were the hands that saved books. They were hands of purpose. She looked down at their joined hands, a blush rising on her cheeks. "I guess they are. All the solvents and tools. It's not very glamorous. Glamour is an illusion," he said, his gaze intense. "Strength is real." He was speaking about more than just her hands. He was speaking about the woman who had faced a room full of judgment with quiet dignity, the woman who chose duty over convenience, the woman who was not afraid to meet his gaze and ask him why. Before she could respond, A sharp, feminine voice sliced through their private world. "Clara, there you are." They both turned. Amelia, the bride, stood in the doorway of the French doors, her perfect white dress glowing in the dim light. Her expression was a carefully constructed mask of concern, but Mathieu could see the steel underneath. Her eyes flickered from Clara's face to Mathieu's, and then, pointedly, down to their still joined hands. Mathieu dropped her hand as if it had been scorched. The old reflexes, the instinct to conceal, to deny, to protect, kicked in with the force of a tidal wave. He felt a cold fury at the intrusion, at Amelia, at the entire world for daring to impose its rules on this one stolen moment. Clara took a small, involuntary step back from him, the spell between them shattering into a million pieces. The connection was severed, the bubble popped. She was once again the awkward cousin, and he was once again the intimidating best man. "Amelia," Clara said, her voice a little too bright. "I was just getting some fresh air." "We were all looking for you," Amelia said, her gaze still fixed on Mathieu, a mixture of suspicion and a strange, proprietary warning in her eyes. She was staking a claim, not just on her cousin, but on the social order of the evening. Mathieu was a figure of immense power, and in her mind he was not meant for the quiet, bookish Clara. "Luca is about to cut the cake. You can't miss it." It was an order disguised as an invitation. "Of course," Clara murmured, her eyes darting to the ground. She wouldn't look at him. "I'm coming." She turned to Mathieu, a flicker of the earlier panic back in her eyes. It was nice talking to you, Mathieu." It was the polite, dismissive phrase of a stranger, a brutal erasing of the intimacy they had just shared. It was a retreat to safety. She walked past him, her bare feet silent on the stone, retrieving her shoes before following Amelia back into the suffocating brightness of the ballroom. She didn't look back. Mathieu stood alone on the terrace, the cold night air suddenly feeling hostile. The warmth of her hand was already a fading memory, replaced by the familiar, icy grip of isolation. He had been given a glimpse of another world, a quieter, warmer, more meaningful world, and then had it snatched away. He heard the band strike up a cheerful, obnoxious song. He heard the roar of laughter from inside. He felt the invisible walls he had built around himself slide back into place, thicker and higher than ever before. But it was different now. Before, he had not known what he was walling himself out from. Now, he did. He looked down at his own hand, the one that had held hers. It looked empty, foreign. He had spent his entire adult life acquiring things. Businesses, territory, loyalty, fear. He had everything a man could want, and nothing that he needed. He turned his back on the light and noise of the party and stared out into the vast, unforgiving darkness. The peace he had felt in her arms was gone, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He had made a mistake tonight. He had allowed a crack in his armor. He had felt something. He wouldn't let it happen again. But as he stood there, a lone figure in the shadows, he knew it was a lie. He had touched her. He had danced with her. He had seen the woman behind the quiet facade. He could build his walls as high as he wanted, but it was too late. She was already inside. The rest of the evening was a study in controlled torture. Mathieu forced himself back into the ballroom, the air now feeling 10 times hotter, the noise of physical assault on his senses. He was a machine, running on the cold, efficient fuel of habit. He nodded. He offered clipped, meaningless pleasantries. He watched Luca and Amelia cut the ridiculously ornate cake. Through it all, he was acutely, painfully aware of Clara. She was on the other side of the room, reabsorbed into the bridal party. She was holding a slice of cake she wasn't eating, her smile a pale, fragile thing she wore like a borrowed coat. She laughed when the other bridesmaids laughed, but her eyes were distant, her thoughts a million miles away. He knew, because his were too. They were back on the terrace, in the moonlight, caught in the echo of a sad, sweet song. Their gazes met only once more across the crowded room. It was a fleeting, accidental collision. He saw a flash of something in her eyes, confusion, regret, a spark of the same longing that was currently hollowing him out from the inside. Then she looked away, her attention immediately claimed by one of the other women. The moment was gone. He left without saying goodbye. He never said goodbye. He simply vanished. His absence a statement more powerful than any farewell. His driver was waiting, the black town car a silent armored cocoon against the outside world. As the car pulled away from the country club, Matteau stared out the tinted window, the manicured lawns and cheerful lights blurring into a meaningless smear. He should have felt relief. He was returning to his element. The silence, the solitude, the cool, detached world of command and control. Instead, he felt a profound and unsettling emptiness. The silence in the car wasn't peaceful. It was barren. It was no longer the sound of his power, but the sound of his loneliness. He kept flexing the hand that had held hers, as if trying to recall the ghost of her touch. The next 2 days were a descent into a familiar hell, but one that now felt different. He immersed himself in his work, using it as a cudgel to beat back the memory of her. He oversaw a series of brutal negotiations with a rival faction, his voice colder, his decisions sharper than ever. He moved millions of dollars with a few keystrokes, dismantled a competitor's business with a single phone call. He was ruthless, efficient, and utterly, completely miserable. Everything was a reminder. The scent of old leather in his study reminded him of her work. A line of poetry he glimpsed in a book reminded him of the quiet intelligence in her eyes. The silence of his vast empty penthouse apartment, once his sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. He was a man haunted not by a ghost, but by a possibility. The possibility of a life that wasn't shrouded in shadow. The possibility of a connection that wasn't based on fear or obligation. He had been given a glimpse of it on the terrace, and now its absence was a constant throbbing ache. By the third night, he knew he had lost the battle. He sat in his study, a glass of untouched Macallan 25 on the polished mahogany desk beside him. The city glittered below his floor-to-ceiling windows, a web of cold, distant lights. He had built this city. He owned a significant piece of its soul. And yet, he felt like a stranger in his own kingdom. He had told himself he would not make the mistake of feeling something again. He had lied. The feeling wasn't gone. It had taken root. It was growing in the darkness, a tenacious, stubborn vine, and its name was Clara. He had a choice. He could do what he always did. Sever the connection. Erase her. Use his vast resources to ensure their paths never crossed again. It would be the smart move, the safe move. It would be a return to the controlled, numb existence he had perfected. Or he could do the other thing. The reckless, insane, illogical thing. He could see her again. The internal debate wasn't a debate at all. It was an inevitability he had been resisting for 72 hours. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a slim, encrypted burner phone. He dialed a number from memory. It was answered on the first ring. Yes? The voice on the other end was clipped, professional. It belonged to a man known only as the Ghost, his top investigator, a man who could find anyone, anywhere, and procure any piece of information without leaving a trace. I have a name, Matteau said, his voice flat, betraying none of the turmoil inside him. Clara Ricci, cousin of Amelia Sterling, the bride from Saturday. I want everything. Where she lives, where she works, her daily routine, her history, everything. But you will be invisible. If she even suspects she's being watched, if a single hair on her head is disturbed, I will hold you personally responsible. There was a pause on the other end. In his 10 years of working for Matteau, the Ghost had been tasked with investigating enemies, rivals, traitors. He had never been asked to investigate a bridesmaid. Understood, the man finally said, his voice betraying no surprise. That was why he was the best. I want the preliminary report on my desk by morning, Matteau added. By morning, the Ghost confirmed. Matteau ended the call and tossed the phone back into the drawer. He leaned back in his leather chair and finally picked up his glass of scotch. He took a long, slow drink, the fiery liquid doing nothing to warm the cold knot in his stomach. He was crossing a line. He knew it. This wasn't business. This wasn't strategy. He was using the vast, dangerous machinery of his empire for a purely personal reason. He He was pointing the full, focused force of his dark world in the direction of a woman who lived in the light. He was a collector of rare, beautiful things. But he had never wanted to possess someone, so completely. He told himself it was just to understand, to know more about the woman who had breached his defenses. But as he stared out at the cold, glittering city, he knew it was a lie. This wasn't about understanding. It was about obsession. And his had just begun. The folder was on his desk the next morning, as promised. It was slim, beige, and utterly unremarkable, which was the ghost's signature. Inside, however, was a life, distilled into bullet points and black and white surveillance photos. Mathieu opened it with a hand that was unnervingly steady. Clara Ricci, age 28, no living parents. Sole proprietor of Ricci Conservation, a small specialized studio in the city's historic district. Residence, a third-floor walk-up apartment above her studio. Education, master's in library science and advanced certificate in conservation from a prestigious university. No significant debts, no criminal record. Social circle, small, consisting of a few colleagues from the academic world. The report was a sketch of a quiet, orderly life, a life of discipline and solitude. He saw a photo of her leaving her studio, a canvas tote bag slung over her shoulder, her brow furrowed in thought. Another showed her at a local market, carefully selecting vegetables, her expression serene. She looked content, at peace in her small, meticulously curated world, a world utterly alien to his. The report concluded with her daily routine. Open studio at 9 a.m. Lunch is typically eaten at her desk. Closes studio at 6 p.m. Lights out in the apartment by 11 p.m. Predictable. Consistent. Predictable. Consistent. These were words he valued in his operations. They meant control, a lack of variables. But seeing them applied to her felt like a desecration. It was a sterile, clinical description of a life that he knew, from that one brief encounter, was anything but. The report contained the facts of her life, but it had captured none of the truth of her. It didn't mention the way her eyes held a flicker of panic, the way her smile was a hesitant sunrise, the quiet strength in her hands, or the devastating grace she possessed even in a moment of chaos. He closed the folder. The information was both everything and nothing. He now knew the logistics of her existence, the map of her days. He could predict where she would be at any given hour. This knowledge should have felt like power, like an advantage. Instead, it felt like a violation. He had taken her quiet, private life and pinned it to a board like a butterfly for examination. A bitter, metallic taste filled his mouth. For the rest of the day, the folder sat on his desk, a silent, potent presence in the room. He conducted his business, his mind a split screen. On one half, he was the ruthless Don, making decisions that would ripple through the city's underworld. On the other, he was thinking about a third-floor walk-up apartment and the woman who lived there, alone, surrounded by her books. As evening approached, he knew what he was going to do. It was a mad impulse, a catastrophic breach of his own protocol. He had the information. The logical next step was to orchestrate a chance encounter, a carefully planned intersection of their worlds. But the thought of such a calculated deception felt cheap. It felt unworthy of her. He wanted something real, something that wasn't a product of his manipulation. He dismissed his driver for the night. He went to his private garage, a climate-controlled vault that housed a collection of cars, each one a weapon of speed and precision. He ignored the Ferraris and the Aston Martins. Instead, he chose a dark, unassuming Audi sedan. A ghost car. Nondescript, untraceable. He drove himself. It was something he hadn't done in years. The feeling of the steering wheel in his hands was both foreign and familiar. He navigated the city's arteries, not as a king in his chariot, but as just another anonymous driver. He moved from the gleaming steel and glass canyons of his downtown territory to the older, quieter part of the city. Here, the buildings were made of brick and stone, their facades bearing the dignified scars of time. It was her part of the city. He found her street easily. It was a narrow, cobblestoned lane lined with gas lamps and small independent shops. A bakery, an antique store, a custom tailor. It felt like a street preserved in amber, a pocket of the past surviving in the relentless present. And there it was. Ricci Conservation. The name was painted in elegant gold script on a window, behind which a wrought iron grille provided security. Above the shop, 2 windows glowed with a soft, warm light. Her light. He parked across the street, in the deep shadows of an old oak tree, and cut the engine. And then, he just watched. He told himself this was reconnaissance, a strategic assessment. But it was a lie. He was a pilgrim who had traveled to a shrine. For nearly an hour, nothing happened. The light in her windows was a steady golden beacon in the gathering dusk. He wondered what she was doing. Reading, mending a book, making dinner. The quiet domestic nature of the images that came to mind was a stark, painful contrast to his own life. His evenings were spent in sterile silence, or in loud, smoke-filled rooms, where loyalty was a currency and betrayal was always a possibility. Then, he saw her. Her silhouette appeared in one of the windows. She was watering a small plant on the windowsill. It was a simple, mundane act. But watching her, haloed by the warm light of her apartment, Matteau felt as if he were witnessing a profound cosmic event. He watched the gentle tilt of her head, the careful way she held the watering can. Even in this small gesture, there was a sense of purpose, of nurturing. She finished with the plant and stood for a moment, looking down at the street. He instinctively shrank back in his seat, his heart pounding with the ridiculous fear of being seen. But her gaze was unfocused, distant. She wasn't looking for anything, or anyone. She was just being. A quiet moment of contemplation. And in that moment, he understood the depth of his folly. He was a creature of the night, a man who thrived in the shadows. He was sitting here, in the dark, spying on a woman who lived in the light. To bring her into his world would be to extinguish that light, to tarnish her quiet grace with the inescapable filth of his own life. The most dangerous thing for her was not his enemies, but him, his interest, his obsession. The thought was like a shard of ice in his chest. For the first time, he considered what was best for her, not what he wanted. And what was best for her was for him to turn the car on, drive away, and never, ever come back. To burn the folder on his desk and erase her from his memory. It was the only honorable thing to do. He put his hand on the ignition, his jaw tight with resolve, but he didn't turn the key. His hand fell away. He couldn't do it. The selfishness that had been his greatest strength was now his most profound weakness. He wanted her. It was a truth that was beyond honor, beyond logic. It was a deep, primal ache. He might be the poison, but he was a man dying of thirst, and she was the only water he had seen in a decade. He watched her turn from the window, her silhouette disappearing back into the warmth of her apartment. The light stayed on. He sat there in the darkness for another hour, a silent guardian, a patient predator, a lost man staring at a window, utterly and completely undone. The next morning, Mathieu woke before dawn from a restless, dream-filled sleep. The images of the night before were seared into his mind. The warm, golden rectangle of her window, her gentle silhouette, the impossible chasm between his world and hers. The resolve he'd felt in the car, the cold, hard knowledge that he should stay away, had evaporated in the harsh light of day, leaving behind only the raw, undeniable engine of his obsession. He would not stay away. He simply had to find a different way in. Manipulation was his art form. He could orchestrate a corporate takeover or a political alliance with the subtle precision of a watchmaker. But this felt different. To approach Clara with a calculated lie felt wrong. It would be starting their story on a foundation of deceit, and some instinct told him that whatever he built with her had to be on solid ground, even if that ground was treacherous. He needed a pretext, a legitimate reason for their paths to cross, a reason that came from her world, not his. He sat in his study, the beige folder open on the desk. He reread the details of her life, not as an investigator, but as a cryptographer searching for a key. Ricci Conservation. Specializes in rare manuscripts and incunabula. Deals with private collectors, universities, museums, And there it was, a door. Not one he could kick down, but one he might be able to unlock. His family, for all its bloody history, had a deep-rooted, almost paradoxical appreciation for the past. They were destroyers of men, but preservers of art. Over the generations, the Moretti family, he used his mother's family name for his legitimate enterprises, had amassed a vast and priceless collection of art, artifacts, and, he vaguely recalled, rare books. The collection was housed in a private, climate-controlled vault at his country estate, an untouchable hoard of cultural treasures acquired through means both legitimate and less so. He rarely paid it any mind. It was a legacy, an asset, nothing more. Until now. He made another call on the burner phone. Not to the ghost, but to a different kind of specialist. A man named Mr. Alistair Finch, the elderly, semi-retired curator who managed the Moretti collection. Finch was one of the few people who knew the full extent of Mathieu's holdings, a man of impeccable discretion and encyclopedic knowledge. "Mr. Finch," Mathieu said when the old man answered, his voice a dry rustle of paper. "I require an inventory of the oldest texts in the collection. Anything pre-16th century. Specifically, I'm looking for something damaged, something in need of expert restoration." There was a long pause. Mathieu could almost hear the gears turning in the old curator's mind. "An interesting request, Mr. Moretti. May I ask the reason for this sudden interest in conservation?" "You may not," Mathieu replied, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Just find me a book, something valuable, something fragile, and something that would require the best in the field." "I see," Finch said, the slightest hint of understanding, and perhaps disapproval in his tone. "I believe I have just the thing. The Sforza Book of Hours, mid-15th century. The vellum is suffering from significant acid degradation, and the pigment on several of the miniatures is flaking. It's a tragedy. It's been on my list of concerns for years." Mathieu felt a jolt, a flicker of what felt like fate. A Book of Hours. The same type of manuscript Clara had been saving on the day of the wedding. It was perfect. "That will do," Mathieu said. "Prepare the necessary provenance documents, legitimate ones. List the owner as the Moretti Trust." "And the conservator you have in mind?" Finch asked, though he likely already knew the answer. Mathieu allowed himself a small, cold smile. "I will handle that myself." He hung up the phone and felt a surge of something he hadn't felt in a long time. The thrill of a truly high-stakes gambit. This was more complex than any business deal. It was an invasion, but one cloaked in legitimacy. He would be approaching her on her own terms, as a client, offering her a piece of the world she loved. He would be the serpent, but he would be offering her the most beautiful, tempting apple. 2 days later, he walked down the cobblestone lane to her studio. He did not arrive in a Blacktown car. He came on foot, alone, wearing a beautifully tailored charcoal suit that was understated yet undeniably expensive. In his hands, he carried a custom-made, climate-controlled archival case. Inside, wrapped in acid-free silk, lay a 500-year-old tragedy. He stopped in front of the shop, Ricci Conservation. He could see her through the window, bent over a large table, a magnifying visor pushed up on her forehead. She was completely absorbed in her work, her focus an impenetrable shield. He watched her for a moment, his heart hammering a heavy, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. This was the point of no return. He took a deep breath, the city air tasting of exhaust and possibility, and pushed open the door. A small, old-fashioned bell chimed above his head. The sound was delicate, clear. Clara looked up, startled by the interruption. Her eyes widened, first in surprise at seeing a visitor, and then in sheer, unadulterated shock as she recognized him. The color drained from her face, then rushed back in a deep, telltale blush. He saw the flicker of panic, the memory of the terrace, the confusion. "Mathieu," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper. She stood up, automatically wiping her hands on her linen apron, a gesture of someone caught off guard. "Clara," he said, his voice calm and level, betraying none of the chaos raging inside him. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod. "I was told this is where I could find the best." He placed the archival case on the counter between them. The soft, metallic click it made as it settled on the polished wood was the only sound in the room. It was the sound of a key turning in a lock, the sound of a trap being sprung. The silence in the small studio was a living thing. It was thick with the scent of old paper, leather, and binding glue, but now it was also charged with the electric hum of 1,000 unspoken questions. Clara stared at the sleek metallic case on her counter as if it were a bomb. Then her gaze lifted to his, and her eyes were a whirlwind of confusion and suspicion. "The best," she repeated, her voice regaining a fraction of its professional composure, though her hands were still fidgeting with the strings of her apron. "The best at what?" "At saving things," Matteo said, his voice a low murmur. He didn't smile. He let the words, and the memory of their conversation on the terrace, hang in the air between them. He saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, the subtle softening of her defensive posture. He had used her own world, her own language, as his key. "I don't understand," she said, but her eyes were fixed on the case. The professional curiosity, the instinct of the conservator, was beginning to override her personal shock. "What is this?" "A problem I'm hoping you can solve," he said. He undid the latches on the case with a series of precise metallic clicks. The sound was unnervingly loud in the quiet room. He opened the lid, revealing the ancient book nestled within its silk shroud. It was not a grand, jewel-encrusted tome, but something far more intimate. A personal book of prayers, its leather cover cracked and faded, its pages whispering of centuries of devotion. He didn't touch it. He simply stepped back, giving her space, ceding control. It was a calculated move. He was entering her domain, and he would play by her rules. Clara moved closer, her hesitation dissolving into pure, focused intent. This was her territory. This was where she was the one in command. She gently pushed the magnifying visor down over her eyes and leaned over the case. With a touch as delicate and reverent as a prayer, she used a pair of tweezers to lift a corner of the silk lining. A soft, sharp gasp escaped her lips. "My God," she whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of horror and awe. "Is this... It can't be. It looks like a Sforza." "It is," Matu confirmed quietly. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief behind the magnifying lenses. "The Sforza Book of Hours? But that's a museum piece. The provenance is legendary. How did you..." She stopped herself, the unasked question hanging in the air. "How does a man like you come to possess a treasure like this?" "My family has been collecting for a very long time," he said, the statement a smooth, polished stone of an answer, offering no cracks for her to peer through. "It has been poorly kept. It needs someone who can not only repair the damage, but who understands its soul." He had chosen his words carefully. Soul. A word that had no place in his world of brutal pragmatism, but he knew it had every place in hers. She was silent for a long moment, her gaze darting between the priceless, damaged book and his own unreadable face. He could see the conflict raging within her. The conservator in her was desperate, hungry to save this masterpiece. It was the project of a lifetime. But the woman in her, the woman who had danced with him in the moonlight, was deeply, profoundly wary. She knew, on an instinctual level, that this was more than just a commission. A book was never just a book, and a man like Mathieu never did anything without a reason. "This is a multi-year project," she said, her voice purely professional now, a shield she was raising against him. The diagnostics alone would take weeks. The cost, it would be astronomical. "The cost is irrelevant," Mathieu said, dismissing a fortune with a wave of his hand. "Time is also not a concern." She took a step back from the counter, crossing her arms over her chest. The apron, the tools, the comforting clutter of her studio seemed to give her strength. "Why me, Mathieu?" she asked, her voice clear and direct. There was no more evasion. "There are larger institutions, museum labs with more resources, more staff." This was the moment, the precipice. He could lie. He could invent a plausible story about wanting privacy, about trusting a small, independent expert, It would be the smart, safe answer. But he was tired of being smart. He was tired of being safe. He looked at her. At this woman who had single-handedly broken through decades of his carefully constructed apathy and chose the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal. The truth. Not the whole truth. Not the dark, bloody truth of his life. But a sliver of it. The only part that mattered. Because the other labs are irrelevant, he said, his voice low and intense, closing the distance between them until only the counter separated them. I am not here for them. I am here for you. Clara's breath hitched. Her professional mask crumbled, revealing the vulnerable, uncertain woman beneath. This book, he continued, gesturing toward the open case, is my excuse. It is my legitimate reason to be in your world, because I know you would never willingly step into mine. I am not a good man, Clara. I live in a world of shadows you cannot even imagine, and the most logical, most sensible thing you could do right now is to tell me to take my book and leave. He held her gaze, his own eyes a stark, honest black. But I am hoping you won't. He had laid his cards on the table. He had admitted to the artifice, confessed to the pretext. He had given her all the power. He had made himself, for the first time in his adult life, completely and utterly vulnerable to rejection. She stared at him, her heart in her eyes. She saw the danger, the darkness he promised, but she also saw the man from the terrace, the one who understood her work, the one who had held her with such gentle reverence. She saw his loneliness, the vast, echoing emptiness that he tried to hide behind his power. He wasn't offering her a simple commission. He was offering her a choice. A dangerous, terrifying, and unbelievably compelling choice. To stay in her safe, quiet world, or to open the cover of the most complicated, most forbidden book she had ever encountered. Slowly, deliberately, she uncrossed her arms. She reached out, and with a hand that trembled almost imperceptibly, she gently closed the lid of the archival case. It wasn't a rejection. It was an acceptance. A closing of one chapter to begin another. The first thing we'll need to do, she said, her voice a soft, steady whisper that sealed both their fates, is a full moisture content analysis. A slow, genuine smile touched Mathieu's lips. It was a rare, unfamiliar feeling, but it was the most real thing he had felt in his entire life. He had come to her with a broken book, but it was his own soul that he was asking her to save, and she had just agreed to try.